You think you have one body. Are you really sure? Maybe you have more than one. Hi, this is Michael Shevack, and welcome to God Search. I'm kind of arbitrarily calling this season two. We are well past 45 different podcasts. It's amazing to me that I had the endurance to do this. I really committed to 90. We'll see what happens at the end of season two. But here, we're going to make a little bit of a turn in season two. We're going to change the structure and the format. Season one was very much giving general educational guidelines to core issues such as non-idolatry, core issues such as spiritual growth, core issues such as the limitations of authority systems, problems in democracy, all sorts of political issues that are really disguised theological issues that no one really deals with. Now we're going to make a little bit of a turn, and it's going to be a little deeper and a little bit more varied. What I'd like to do is begin with a very delicate matter, a very confusing matter. A lot of people have a kind of arbitrariness to how they think. Again, the very controversial abortion issue. Is there a soul that precedes a body? Is there a body that is followed by a soul? Is the soul a piece of divinity so that if you shorten the lifespan artificially of an embryo, you have betrayed the very essence of God? You see, a subject like abortion opens up a kind of mystery to how does life work? How does life work? And on a God search, whether you're aware of it or not, there's always a part of you that is intellectually seeking to understand your God experience and create a kind of model for it. Just like any kind of learning, any kind of technology, you have experiences which you want to be able to understand how they might happen. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, someone called me. They had an illness. Well, they were 3,000 miles away. And on my God search for whatever reason, happened to develop some medical empathic things. In other words, abilities to see things on people's bodies. Could be part of my bad Jewish dream of having been a medical student once. But that learning it came to the point that I can see certain things long distance. It just happens. It's not a big deal. It's a Jedi trick. But in that process, what happens is when I can actually look inside, quote unquote, inside a physical body and see what's going on and suggest that, this is the cause and stuff, I had to take a look at that and say, okay, isn't this interesting? How does life work? So that's happened. Can that happen? How can I see something which is 3,000 miles away? Obviously, what we commonly call distance is not a reality in that kind of phenomenon. So I have to take a look at that. And if you're interested in inquiring how this takes place and you're interested in integrating the various kinds of knowledge, you have to combine that with special relativity from Einstein, where there's, and include the limit to the speed of light. You have all sorts of phenomenon that have to be accounted for. How do you do that? And what is the model by which that takes place? So there's a learning that takes place. There is, and you will notice this more as you deepen your God search, that there's a lot of unusual phenomena that take place. And there is a lot of confusion around how it takes place, a lot of debate. I'm basically a spiritual scientist. In other words, I believe that spirituality is not woo-woo, that it's a science from the Latin sciens, meaning to know, and that the more that people have objective, God experiences, objective experiences called God, meaning increased experiences of good, of unity, of truth, the more we will have a consensus of people that we can test and double blind test and actually learn what the phenomena is on the scale of human life and the ability of human senses and measurement to quantify and make a model. So, what I'd like to do is kind of give you a leg up, okay? It's been my experience that, having started as a kind of a really, truly, you know, dyed in the wool, you know, diehard atheist, and materialist, that it's been my experience that um, thinking of the human being as merely one body, merely having a physical body, and that this physical body is a clod of stuff, okay, and then it dies, does not help one understand what's going on. On the other hand, words like soul, words like, spirit, we use them because they're there. But we have difficulty knowing what they are, and they are kind of, from my point of view, they're theoretical entities. They're really constructs. And virtually everything is an intellectual construct and a model other than your naked experience of it, but your understanding of any how or any kind of structure or laws or operative theory by which something takes place is a construct. But it becomes blatantly obvious as you develop more spiritually and you have uncanny experiences that there have to be kind of understandings that help you facilitate it. Like any science, if you have an understanding and based on the understanding you can predict things taking place based on that understanding, then that understanding can be considered a very reliable theory. Now, it doesn't mean it's fact. It means it's a theory and it's a way to frame it and explain it. But it doesn't mean it's actually how it works. I mean, certain Newton's understandings of inertia and, water in a pail that circulates like this, we spin it around and it keeps the water in the pail. That was a theory and it worked very, very well, but more refined theories took place a couple of hundred years later with Einstein. And so theories can be updated, but theories become very valuable as a way of framing things. When I started to have certain kinds of what people call psychic phenomena, where I could, you know, see things, um, I couldn't explain it by simply saying that what I see as my body or what I see as someone else's body is just that lump. So I'm going to suggest to you, and I'm going to share this with you. I'm not going to tell you what it is, you know. I'm not going to say this is it. This is absolutely 100%. I'm going to share a little bit of my theory. Okay. And it's a theory that is well tested from years and years and years and years of experience. I didn't go about this theory in an armchair. All right. It had to be tested against my experience. And to the best that I'm capable, it had to be tested against known, scientific theories, and it had to kind of hold together. One of the measures of truth is coherency. If you're going to assert a model, it has to be coherent and it has to fit together like pieces of a puzzle with other models. So I'm going to give you a theory. We seem to have one physical body, and we oftentimes equate that physical body with the stuff that's left behind. And I'd like to say that I think that that's not true. There is nothing I have experienced that leads me to believe that that clod of stuff that I leave on the earth that's left behind from my relatives is the actual physical body. I've come to the conclusion, and it's much deeper than I'm going to go here. I'm only going to start at the very beginning, that minimally we have two aspects or two bodies that are part of what we call our physical body. Our physical body has a very basic material or elemental aspect. It that material or elemental stuff, that's the stuff we leave behind that's recycled back and composted into the planet. Okay? That's the remains. That's material or elemental, meaning it contains the elements and, the carbon and the oxygen and the nitrogen and all that kind of stuff. But we also have what one might call a thought body. The words are so hard. A thought body, a subtle body, um, a light body. I happen to like that. Some people might say an electromagnetic body, but then again, you know, matter is also electromagnetic. It's also a wave. And so these words are very difficult. We're talking about different scales, different frequencies and amplitudes, more than we're talking different entities. But I'd like you to imagine for a second that your physical body is not just this lump, but it has a material aspect or a material or elemental body, and it also has, let's say, an electromagnetic or a light body. I want to use the word light body or subtle body or light body. And I'd like you to imagine that we have these two aspects. And I'd like you to imagine for a second that the combination of the light body with the material body is what creates you. And that when you so-called die, meaning the elemental or the material body is returned to the earth, there still remains a light body which contains information from the material body, and it also contains information from the universal structure in which we live, since that's where light comes from. Matter does as well, but light is more intimately attached to the more, you know, dramatic of the powers. So I'd like you to imagine that structure for a second. And I'd like you to imagine that when everything comes into existence through a burst of light, that light has information in it. Now, that might be something which is very strange, but in an era where we have fiber optics, we know for a fact that knowledge and information can be transmitted on frequencies of light. We know that's a fact. We also know we can transmit information by laser beam. So the idea that I'm proposing and seems to fit coherently is that light, which is the the initiating force of everything, seems to me to contain information, and that contains information from the universe or possible other universes or whatever the scale is. And that goes into the creating of our universe, including our solar system, which is another scale of light that also contains information, and the Earth, which originally broke away as pieces of the sun or pieces of floating matter that then, began to take orbit around our sun as everything was in formation. But what we're talking about is that there's information in each scale, and that there's a material scale with its information, in a way, a kind of form of light. And then there's information in light. And then what happens is, if you follow some basic, biochemistry, somewhere on the earth, at a time where we had a more primitive atmosphere of methane and ammonia and water vapor, um, well, what happened was some kind of electrical, which is an electromagnetic spark, a kind of lower level of sunlight, okay, interacted with the primitive sea where these things were very, very prominent, and the atmosphere, and you had the beginning of a transfer of knowledge, where whatever knowledge was contained in the light, which was necessary for creation and transmitted through the solar levels, became transmitted through the electrical and interacted with the material on the planet and the material atmosphere and began to develop amino acids, which are the beginning rudiments of protein. And that began to form a kind of electromagnetic template that included the electricity, which is derived from the sun and from the materiality itself, so that you began to form a kind of light body on its own proper scale that became the rudiment of what we have as physical life. The materiality kind of merged, the elements merged with the electromagnetics of electricity, and then more knowledge that was present in light began to be able to be downloaded into this material embryo, and life began to emerge. Now, does not mean there is not a God, meaning there isn't an intelligence which is guiding the entire process. But nonetheless, this is a very kind of abstract theory, which for me works. So I'm sharing it with you. So you have the raising up of amino acids and proteins. You have light, which is feeding information and knowledge to that system and beginning to encode it in the form of eventually some kind of messenger RNA and DNA, and you get the beginnings of uh, primitive life, primitive life, which raises higher and higher and higher and higher. So we begin with two bodies, one which is a material body, and the material body interacts with the light body, and it produces a kind of shared light body, which is an electromagnetic field. And this is the rudiments of who we are. Now, this may seem to kind of be very clumsy, but if you take the idea that we minimally have two bodies, that our physical body has a material body and a light body and a kind of interstitial body, which is I'm calling, electromagnetic. These words are very, very nasty, you know. But if you take that structure of a two parts or two bodies in the one body, the physical body containing a light body and a material body, and they're both, variants of electromagnetic, and we look at it life through that, we suddenly can have an aha moment. We suddenly can understand how, upon death, that we don't leave our body, meaning a soul float, 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 float away. We leave our body like a sack of stuff on the road waiting for the garbage man to pick it up. The earth will recycle it. We leave it. And yet there we still have recorded information that's recorded in the light, that on our light bodies, And therefore, there is a continuity of ourselves beyond death, and there is a continuity of the transmission of each individual knowledge to our future growth, our future evolution, and to our species, and to other species, and to the material planet and universe of which we are a part. Once you begin to see yourself as having two bodies, minimally two bodies, it's a little more complicated. Minimally two bodies. You can begin to understand rationally life after death. But it's even more so. You can understand life after death, but by the same token, you can understand that there may be clearly a pre-birth soul. I mean, I'm not fond of that word. A, a light body that precedes a new material body that is created and that can conjoin with the new light body that is generated with the next life. So there is a continuity. The light body from the previous life can merge with the life body of a second life. And this, of course, is a workable structure that allows you to have a kind of reincarnation. But let's go further. If you have a continuity of an individual life, meaning you have a new life body, light body, and then you add in the light body from the previous light, that's on an individual level, but the same structure would be absolutely an excellent theory for explaining how there's not just individual growth, but there is actually patterning of evolving life from the most primitive physical bodies to more advanced physical bodies as the knowledge from each successive stage of life, followed by death, and the embodiment and the encoding of the knowledge in light, and then eventually in the organic material structure, which we call DNA. And what we now have is with a simple two-body structure, you can explain how certain species have knowledge which is transmitted after their death as a species to the development of new species and to the development of the planet. Because, the White Cliffs of Dover were created by, some kind of planktonic algae. So life changes even the structure of the earth. So with a two-part body, you can explain life after death, pre-life soul, evolution. You can also explain some of the more exotic experiences that one might have on a God search. You might explain, for instance, ghosts. After one dies, there might remain an electromagnetic body that may stay connected in some way to the volition of the human being, to their ego, and have an independence in a different kind of form, an electromagnetic ghost body afterwards, and it would explain why it affects the electrical devices and stuff. It might explain certainly psychic phenomenon for sure, from my point of view, because when you can actually read off of people and you actually can communicate long distances and you get impressions and you know when someone's trying to reach you and you call them, all of these are spiritual phenomenon that are common as you continue your God search. It explains it because we're communicating on through a different kind of body where the basic laws of physics that are limiting um, are not applicable. So psychic phenomenon can be explained. It's a model. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's a good model for explaining it. So it explains ghosts, psychic phenomenon, as I said, reincarnation. It can also explain some of the stranger things, such as shape shifting like Native Americans who claim to be able to actually physically alter themselves on a material level to transform from one body to another. I don't know whether that's true. The literature has a couple of variations of it where you possess an existing animal, or some are more actual transformative, like princes into frogs and frogs into princes and beauties and the beast and all that whole stuff. But nonetheless, you cannot possibly have an intelligent model for it if you're simply keeping the physical body to be a clod of gunk, all right? And you're keeping it as a single body that's just a single body. You can't do it. It's not explicable. So if you begin to view your physical body as having two parts, and you begin to identify the light body with a kind of thought body, which is an aspect of yourself that is apart from your body materially. You begin to understand why you sometimes feel a sense of self as if you are in your body and that you're not just your body. It kind of explains your intuitive sense that you're more than the clod that you're in. And certainly you are, because if you cut a finger or even cut a finger off, you're still there. And if you keep cutting and keep cutting and keep cutting, you're still there until you cut to the point where your there-ness can't be there because you've prevented you, other aspects of your light body from finding a home. So this idea of having more than one body explains even your day-to-day sense that there is something more complex than you. And it eggs you on to search more. No one goes on a God search unless they have an intuitive sense, some kind of, spark of life in them that sends them on that path. There has to be a kind of desire. No kid playing with a fire truck wants to be a fireman unless there's an impulse that excites him about the idea of putting out fires. We have this impulse to seek, and this impulse to seek is what fires us up on a God search. And hopefully, what I'm doing on God search is just firing up what is naturally yours. By the way, please go to yourgodsearch.com and welcome to season two. And please give me some of your ideas on some of the things that you would like to explore. I'd like to begin the process of interviewing some people from different religions, maybe not even the more ordinary religions, even the more controversial ones, and really get a sense of depth of the panorama of spiritual phenomena out there, because I think it's very interesting and it will help everyone in this age of freedom where we have so many options to explore, so many exciting spiritual venues and sources of knowledge, that I think it's part of the overall educational process. So, what I'd like you to do is think about this idea of having two bodies, and now think about it in terms of your relationships. If you have two bodies, let's say minimally, you're not only talking about relationships between your material bodies, you're also talking about relationships between your light body. You're talking about the sharing of knowledge on subtle levels. You're talking about the sharing of knowledge on material levels. You're talking about what we call the planet materially sharing itself in us with someone else, and the planet itself growing in us and through us by combination. We begin to see the mystery of marriage, where the bodies conjoin and the planets evolve in us, through us, in future generations, and we're part of this enormous creational gift that we are part of. We also can see the subtle differences in knowledge and framings of knowledge. Knowledge that's universal, that's part of the larger, wider scope of light, and the knowledge which is more particular, which is part of the more earthly human experiences, including our beliefs on how these things take place, which are part of forming cultures and different educational systems and knowledge and spiritual systems as well. So that's part of the miracle of marriage. We can also understand with a two-part bodily system, we can begin to understand that there is a difference, for instance, between the sex of the species and the genders, that genders are much more plastic and complex, and the sharing of information that creates different gender notions is much more diversified than it is on the material aspect of our physical body. The more subtle light-based aspect of our physical bodies have a greater plasticity. So we begin to understand that there is a structure here that's responsible for some of the controversies around someone's sex and someone's gender, and that there can be a discord within people between these two levels, and that it's not an abnormality. It's an exaggerated view of extreme potential and creative variation that exists within human beings. The other thing that we can begin to see is that there is the emergence through the human being of a kind of third body that begins to take place, which is when my mind asserts itself over the earth to create agriculture, or asserts itself over metal to smelt it into materials. When I create any kind of technology, what I'm doing is asserting a larger mind that's in me, call it the universal mind. Some people might call it God on a certain level, through me. And then, through my individuality, begin to transform aspects of creation, imposing my life force upon that so that we bring things into human dominion, human control. This is the process of technology. This is the process of, oh, animal husbandry, of domestication, where animals are brought in under human consciousness, and that human consciousness becomes part of the evolutionary process of the animal. An example of that, I think, though I'm not a biologist, is wolves. You know, in less than 40,000 years, 35,000 years, we went from wolves, which were the original canine, to Norwich Terriers and poodles. And it's the laws of the current theory of evolution does not permit that degree of accelerated, you know, dramatic change. But if there's another body that's involved, which is the thought body of humanity, actually enters and accelerates the direction of evolution for human need, which is called human free will. You know, we talked about this in other forms. Well, then it becomes explicable. So, if you imagine our humanity as being a light body that transmits knowledge from our universe and beyond, and then interacts with more, shall we say, dense forms of light or electromagnetics that originate from the planet, and that the light and the matter merge into a living physicality. And then that can impose itself and begin to assert dominion over other lives and the planet, and indeed the whole universe, if not beyond. You have the two bodily aspects of the human being creating a force which introduces a third aspect, which is the human power in creation. And that gives us the birth of history, of what is the place of us. You know, are we the civilization that truly creates Star Trek, Star Wars? Science fiction is not science fiction. And it also opens up, shall we say, the challenge of UFOs. Because if we have this two-part body, and there is an evolution of us because of the interaction of a universal light body with the particular material body, then there can be easily other creatures who share the greatness of the universal knowledge, a sense of a universal mind and a cosmic sense of order and the location of things, with a difference in particular development, difference in planetary development, a difference in uh, the advancement of the material aspect of their bodies so that they can also be universal like we, but they can be at different scales of evolution, lower or higher. What we now have with this simple introduction of a two-part body, we now have the beginning of an application of a theory that allows for life and differences of scale, and also commonalities between us and other beings that may exist in other parts of our universe. Now, there are some people out there who say this is unnecessary. This is a violation of spirituality. This is a violation of religion. And I would say this is nonsense. We are living in an era where we are exploring our universe and we are exploring in miraculous ways, not just the galaxy, but the actual formation of everything within everything. There is no way we can have true spiritual development or religious development unless we begin to develop a scientific spirituality, a scientific spirituality which includes, as we said way, way back in season one, the substantial aspects of truth. What are what is the equation, if there is one, of love? How do we explain love, feeling, compassion, creativity, vision, all sorts of things that are part of this amazing world we live in that makes us, shall we say, spiritual, made, pardon my Hebrew bias, made in the image and likeness of God, meaning reflective of the creativity and immense diversity that God can create in an individual form, demut, in likeness, meaning reflection of God's attributes and being in an individuality and an ego that can assert individual differences and make individual changes and have individual components that we add into existence so that each of our lives matters. Each of our lives matters. Anyway, it's a theory. Now, over the past 30, 40 years, I've developed the theory. It's more cogent. I can lay it out in a much more simple form. But it's at that point it gets so packed, it's very, very hard to communicate it because people haven't put the time into understanding what these little structures are. So I hope that you were able to follow this. I've done the best job possible. As I continue my God search, I learn how to put this in language which is easier for me. And then I can communicate it to other people, which, I have to do as a teacher. And I thank you for joining me on God Search Season 2. Um, Come back, continue your God search, uncover God, discover God, and recover a truly objective scientific spirituality that allows your intellect to understand what it is about the uniqueness of the human spiritual experience so that you can frame it and teach it to the next generation, and we can have a continual growth and flourishing of the best of what a human being can be. This is Michael Shevack. Thank you so much. See you next Wednesday about 5:45 Eastern daytime. All right. God bless. Bye-bye.